Anyway, thanks so much for having me invited to speak to you tonight about sustainable investments and COVID-19. And there were a few things that caught my attention during the presentations we had before. First of all, someone said we need networks. Well, Swiss Sustainable Finance is actually a network. We created the association 6 years ago and now count 150 members and network partners, all large companies and small players, very mixed. We have universities on board, 2 other associations. Well, Jonathan also mentioned we have enough. I'm working in the industry where this belief is maybe not so widespread. I'm working for the finance industry where everybody tends to think that we always need more, but we are aware that we all have pension funds and everything, so they do actually need a return. And then last but not least, Rudy mentioned that crisis makes things possible. I find this very encouraging, especially in the current situation that we see. And we also see that a lot of things are moving thanks to COVID-19 with regards to sustainable investing. And I would like to dive a bit deeper here. So it seems I've lost control again. Now, there we go. Just a very few words about Swiss Sustainable Finance. Our vision is really to make the Swiss Financial Center a leading voice and actor in sustainable finance with the clear goal of contributing to a sustainable and prosperous economy. And we have three main priorities in doing this. First of all, we are shaping and informing on best practice. That means on the one hand, we prepare a lot of reports and guidance for our members. And we've worked quite a bit on sustainable finance education. Maybe the ones of you that are interested in the subject might want to check our website where we have an online e-learning tool on sustainable investing. 4 modules actually covering the topic in depth. The second pillar is creating supportive frameworks and tools, and that's where we most work with our members. We have different work groups where we provide tools that are useful for them. Right now in wealth and asset management, we very much work on the EU action plan and try to demonstrate to our members what it means for them, the new regulation, and how they can react to it. We have a group on impact investing, and we also work on the financing the transition to a low carbon economy. We will come out with a large report later this year, probably Q3. You might want to check out our website too. But an important pillar for us is also the constant dialogue with our members. We had a lot of events going on and now have online events too to interrelate with our members. But increasingly so, political dialogue is important for us. We are represented in government work groups on this subject and are also closely working with other finance associations to drive the topic. International representation gets more and more important. We represent Switzerland in the FC4S network, that stands for Financial Centers for Sustainability, now a network of 30 financial centers across the globe trying to promote this topic. These are just a few of our activities. Now I would want to dive a bit deeper into our latest market study. We launched it earlier in June. It's actually a study that we prepared jointly with CSP, where Falco has his main job, so with University of Zurich, which was a great pleasure. We did that for the 3rd time in a row. We had 76 participants in our survey, and that means both asset managers and banks, but also large institutional asset owners. So with that, I think we can provide a fair overview on what has happened in the Swiss market in this field. I skipped the rest and really just straight dive into the results. And I think this is the most important slide of the report. We saw a 62% growth compared to the previous year, which is of course quite impressive. The main growth this time stemmed from asset managers with funds and mandates growing quite a bit. the funds by 147%. The mandates almost doubled. And this time, for the first time, we actually breached the 1 trillion Swiss franc mark for this kind of market. I think that's quite impressive because it already represents about every third franc that is invested in Switzerland. What has driven this strong development? I think we saw three main factors that drove it. On the one hand, there is an increasing amount of funds and mandates that apply sustainability criteria. All the volumes that we count here, they apply at least one of 8 approaches as we defined them. I will show them to you later on. So an increasing number of asset managers apply such criteria to the funds that they already manage, but we also see inflows into sustainable products. On the other hand, we did have a performance effect last year. About 8 percentage points of this, 18 percentage points are actually related to performance, so almost a third. And a smaller part is also due to a slight change in our methodology, which probably encouraged asset managers to show us even more funds and mandates that are managed sustainably. If we look at the details of the applied approaches, we still have ESG integration and exclusions on the first 2 ranks. That's the same as last year. But something we saw was a strong shift in ESG engagement. And not only in ESG engagement, but also in ESG voting and in impact investing. These were the 3 approaches that had the strongest growth. Now, we take this as a clear signal that investors actually shift to approaches where they have an outcome in the real economy or even an impact, depending on how you define this. And we think this is quite encouraging. For us, it's also a sign that somehow this whole sustainable investment market is moving into a 3rd phase. In a first phase, we mainly had people excluding certain activities, or we had a small share of investors focusing on best-in-class companies. In a second phase, we increasingly saw the so-called ESG integration, which really relates to financial analysts and portfolio managers taking such factors into account, mainly with a financial objective. I would say the main objective of ESG integration is improving the risk return of your investments. And now in the 3rd phase, we see this shift towards approaches that try to have a dialogue with the real economy, where investors actually contact companies and try to influence, for example, their climate policy or their supply chain policies. And in the case of voting, where they actively use their voting rights, also with an ESG policy behind it. And impact investing, again, focuses on a more clearer impact that is also measurable. So this we find rather encouraging. For the first time, I'm losing control. Here we're back again. For the first time, we looked at how these different approaches are actually combined. We wanted to know what kind of volumes use which kind of combinations. That's something we couldn't see in previous studies. And this is the result of this. These are the top 5 combinations applied by asset managers and asset owners in Switzerland. And you can see that only one of the top 5 relies on just one of these different approaches. All others actually combine different ways of integrating ESG factors. So top, we have the combination of exclusions and ESG integration. And the second most frequently applied combination even adds norms-based screening and engagement activities to this. Maybe something that is quite compelling is that we don't see the more stricter approaches like best in class or thematic investments or impact investing in these top 5 combinations. That clearly demonstrates that here we have the main assets from large institutional asset owners, and they generally prefer approaches that have a less limiting effect on their investment universe, I would say. But nevertheless, I think it does show that this market is becoming more sophisticated over time, and investors choose to combine different approaches. Now, I would want to shift to the question around COVID-19 and sustainable finance. And first, I would like to show you some thoughts on how COVID-19 has actually influenced the sustainable investment sphere. We saw a few tendencies, and some of them are listed on this slide. One important factor was that throughout the crisis, sustainable investments actually outperformed the market. We saw that in many different studies. It was studies prepared by index providers that looked at the performance of sustainability indices versus the main market, but it was also studies from different asset managers looking at the performance of their portfolios, and it was across different regions. It was both in developed and emerging economies, and it was also across asset classes that we saw lower volatility, but also better absolute performance, which is definitely a very positive sign. What's the reason for this? Well, part of the fact is definitely that some of these ESG funds have less exposure to oil stocks and generally fossil fuel stocks, which of course suffered quite a lot in the crisis. But an important part is also that many of these companies with high ESG scores just demonstrated stronger fundamentals and a better resilience overall. What were the factors that mainly drove this? Some analysts say it was factors around supply chain management, about human capital, but of course also overall governance. All of these contributed to the better, obviously also better financial performance of such high ESG score stocks. What we also saw is that even during the crisis, there was growing client demand for sustainable investing. There were some studies that looked at fund in and outflows. And while you saw quite a lot of outflows from the broad market products, we saw a lot less outflow in sustainable funds, and at the same time, strong inflows during the whole Q1 into sustainable funds. Something that was particularly striking was that this was also true for the US, where sustainable investing is still in its infancy compared to Europe. So even in the US, we saw 4 times as high inflows into sustainable funds as in the previous year, the same period. Generally, with the growing client demand for sustainable investments, we also see stronger calls for more standardization and for concrete impact. This is something we often hear from clients. They would want to see impact. We know impact in the context of listed equity is not very easy to measure, and the CSP has done quite some research on this. They find the strongest impact actually for engaging strategies. So we have to see how we move forward on impact, but that's something clients look for. What I also find quite striking is that it made investors focus on the long-term perspective again, this whole crisis. I also saw that social factors are just moving into focus again. In the past year, before the crisis, the main dominating topic was climate change. We know it still is, and it's back high on the agenda, but I saw that a lot of investors realize how closely these different topics, E, S, and G, are interrelated, and you also have to build on them. You need good human capital to address such challenges. You need strong supply chains to be resilient in a crisis. So this shift to social, I would say, is also linked to COVID-19 and the resulting crisis. One thing that is clear, we now live in a world, as we heard it, the crisis is always an opportunity, but it means you need fast transformation capacities. And it seems that stocks with a high ESG rating are better at transforming and adopting to such new challenges and also reacting faster, maybe linked to the good governance and the good human capital indicators. These are just a few thoughts on how COVID-19 has influenced sustainable investing. And now the other perspective, how can sustainable investing help tackle the crisis? There we've also seen quite a lot of movements. First of all, we saw a lot of investor engagement for COVID-19 actions. There were investors calling on the pharmaceuticals to cooperate better in preparing vaccines. There were investors calling on, especially on the European Union, to actually use their recovery packages to also drive the economy towards sustainable solutions. But there were also investors that generally just called for good company action and maybe for social, well, to treat their workforce well, to look at, to maybe forego dividends and instead not make people redundant. These were engagement topics that we saw coming up. Generally, we also heard, for example, from the European Union that they want to link recovery packages to climate change, that they want to feed capital, especially, again, we heard it previously that they increased the Green Deal, but also there are discussions about share buyback programs that should be limited to certain, or should forego certain industries such as the fossil fuel industry. And last but not least, one trend that was striking to me is that generally fintech solutions helped tackle the crisis, but also I think the crisis will lead to a strong boom of fintech solutions. We all know it starts with payment. We all started using just digital payment in this crisis, but we saw a lot of crowdfunding platforms that stepped in on a local level to help support SMEs. And generally, I think it will be a strong driver for further fintech solutions that also help grow sustainable investing. That brings me to the end. I thank you for your attention. And of course, I'm also happy to take a question or two.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sabine. Yeah, there was a couple comments in the chat about what ESG means, and are we talking about big companies that are investing, or are we talking about individual investors who are, and you're kind of keeping track of the ESG investments that they're involved in? Who are we really talking about right now, and who are we should be watching? And there is another question about how do we move these big players forward, because they're seeing the value in looking forward, right? And looking in the long term and looking forward when COVID came. And this is because before, correct me if I'm wrong, before, everyone thought that investing in oil and these sort of very stable things were the way to go, but now people are seeing that maybe that was the wrong way, or things are changing. Is this what you're saying?
Well, partly, I would say. First of all, what do we talk about when we look at these figures? We do mainly talk about the large institutional investors because they have the largest buckets of money. So 80% of what you see in these figures actually stems from pension funds, insurance companies, foundations, and other large investors. And only about 20% stems from private investors. That has actually changed quite a bit. About 5 years ago, it was almost the other way around. So it was only in the past 5 years that we really saw the large institutionals adopting such strategies. And I clearly see them as drivers. If you look at investor engagement, you need to be a rather large investor to even have the resources to join such programs. An encouraging initiative is Climate Action 100+, an engagement initiative where investors try to influence companies to adapt their climate strategies and make clear commitments to a low carbon future, even to net zero emissions by 2050. For example, Nestle was driven to commit to net zero emissions by 2050. Yes, we all know for now these are just words, but they commit to it and then also try to demonstrate the actual reduction path to such a goal. And that was investor driven. But I don't know if it answers the full question.
No, I mean, it's just I'm not a finance person. I'll be very blunt. I'm a people person, but it's important to talk about and understand these things because all this money is tied up, and the speakers before also mentioned following the money, and it's important that we have organizations like yourself that are trying to influence all of these companies to kind of push money in a better way, I guess.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And of course, you always need both. I also have two souls in my heart. In a way, you need the impact investors focusing on local individual projects and small companies, social enterprises. They can really fuel change in the local environment. But on the other hand, you do need to change with the large economy. And there, of course, you can only take incremental steps, and many of these steps are too slow as they happen now. But I also see a strong acceleration, and I'm pretty convinced that 5 years from now, we will look back and say, wow, something has really changed now. And we do see a lot more ambitious sustainability strategies of large corporates as well. If I only see the shift that has happened with Swiss investors in the past 2 years, so much has happened. I wouldn't say all of these volumes have true impact today, but once you start dealing with sustainable investing, you take a first step, and then maybe you move on to another step, which has more impact in the second phase.
Yeah.